Bread. I was driving down an urban street on the south side of Chicago, sealed in my car 500 miles away from home. Yet, I smelled bread. Was it my grandmother's rolls I smelled, or my mother's soft white bread with the hard, crunchy crust surrounding it? Bread, memories, taking me home in the midst of a strange place. A friend informs me that the Wholesome Bread Company has a factory on 55th Street. I wish all air pollution smelled so wonderful. Bread is so important. Jesus used it as a symbol for his body. He taught us that we should pray for our daily bread. And when I was in seminary, when we were learning our Greek, the word that's translated as daily is very idiosyncratic. It's the only instance of it in the New Testament. It's almost impossible to translate. There's several things that might be necessary. It looks like it might be a Greek compound or a Greek attempt at matching a compound word that might have been in the Aramaic. And our professor said, because this is so strange, this is probably the only word that we can be sure that Jesus might have actually said. Everywhere that wheat is a primary grain, bread is a basic food. Different from rice, which is served up as it is in a bowl, bread is processed. It is a ritual to even make it. It's a basic food. Even harshly punished criminals are given bread and water. It's used as a slang term for money. It's important. Now, when I was younger, stores only sold one type of bread. It was white and mushy with a soft crust. A popular brand was Wonder Bread. It was a wonder you could even call it bread. In the past 20 years, 30 years, our nation has diversified in its bread and its peoples. In addition to white, you can buy Italian bread, tortillas, pumpernickel, pita, bagels, wheat bread, and more. The bountiful world of bread is at the supermarket. Bread recipes from all over the earth. The earth. The soil. We've lost touch with the soil. For bread does not come from the store. It comes from grain, and the grain comes from the soil. Earlier agrarian cultures knew where their bread came from, and they celebrated, especially this time of year when the first wheat crop was harvested. Lammas, or Lunacid, occurs in late July and early August. It marks the middle of the summer or the early fall. It's the first of 3 harvest festivals and usually is associated with the grain. It heralds the coming of autumn. The goddess manifests herself as Demeter, Ceres, Corn Mother, and other agricultural goddesses. The god is Lu, John Barleycorn, and other vegetation gods. It's a festival of prosperity and plenty. Lammas was the medieval Christian name for the holiday. It means literally loaf mass, the mass where you have loaves of bread. this day when loaves were baked and placed on the altar as offerings. It represents the ancient tradition in the Old Testament of bringing your first fruits. It's the start of the harvest season, a time when the fertility of the earth is so abundant. Centuries-old customs have people making corn dollies out of the dried corn leaves, making dolls, burning the doll that they kept from last year, and starting afresh. The Irish referred to this fest as Lunasa, a feast to commemorate the funeral games of an Irish sun god named Lugh. However, it's not Lugh's death that's celebrated. In a long, involved story, it ends up being his way of honoring his stepmother who took care of him when he was abandoned. It is a bread festival surrounded in the idea of caring, the nurture, celebrating the woman who gave him a home. The ceremonial highlights of such festivals is a wheel that is set on fire and rolled down the hill, symbolizing the beginning of the descent of the sun. This later became known as a Catherine wheel, named after St. Catherine, who was, in the Catholic scheme of things, the patron saint of millers, the people who ground the grain. And so all the traditions kind of merge at this time around this idea of the bread of life. Now for us, especially those of us with small children, the end of summer ritual is the back to school sale. Now, I stopped by Walmart this weekend, picking up something else totally, and discovered it was the state of North Carolina's tax-free day. I felt like I was in a wheel on fire, being rolled downhill. This is the season of abundance. The grain ripens early: corn, wheat, barley, rye. Bread can be made almost immediately. The fermented grain beverages must wait till Oktoberfest. But August is the time for bread. Our poetry, "O beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain," it's a symbol of our nation's bounty. We produce a large proportion of the world's food, the breadbasket. Our government makes bread the basis of our food pyramid. It is the staple of our existence. It is so present that bread often goes unnoticed. If you're having a sandwich, you always identify it by what's in between the breads, with the exception of when people say a ham on rye. Rye still has an edge to it that makes it special, I guess. But most bread is just ignored when you talk about what the sandwich is. But bread is so pervasive that it seeps into the deepest regions of our psyche. That's why I was reminded of home when I drove past the bread factory. Our earliest ancestors had to learn how to make bread. It reflects their intelligence. It reflects their community. A lone nomad can spear a rabbit, pick a fruit off a tree, but bread does not come from people wandering alone. It is a food of a settled people, tied to a particular place, preparing planting, waiting, harvesting. And then even harvested, it can't be eaten directly. Who was the first person who ground it between two rocks and got a powder? What benefit was that? Probably none at first, till somebody came by and spilled some water on it. And then they just left it on the rock, that mess, didn't want to take credit for it, walked away, and it was a particular hot day, and they came back, and it had kind of crusted over there. And they said, well, you try it. And then the people who had to think of adding yeast to it so that it would rise up. Who were these people? And they had to pass this knowledge from generation to generation, the person to person, acting as if they had planned it all along. The trial and error that went into this. Bread could not exist without community. It is born of community, and that's why it has been such a strong symbol of family and community. Now, with the corporate farm and the bread factories, we can become a bit detached from making bread. Wrapped in plastic on the grocer's shelf, it's lost its fragrance. It's clean and sterile, pre-sliced to make a tidy sandwich. Our lives have taken away most of the time necessary to bake bread. And several years ago, people started to rebel. They brought these bread-making machines. Now, my grandmother's bread-making machine was this oven that was this big thing in the middle of her kitchen, but my generation seemed to forget that and seemed to be buying these countertop machines that would do some of the mixing and the waiting, and you could set it up and go to work and come back home and have bread, or have bread in the morning when you woke up. It helped make fresh bread congruent with our busy lifestyles. See, I never bought one because I would look at the price and say, now how many loaves of bread could I buy for $300? But I know these fill a need. They fill a need. The aromatherapy in itself is worth it. It's a high-tech blast from the past. Bread has so much more meaning than its role as a carbohydrate. We sang earlier today, we're going to sit at the welcome table. Bread is how we welcome each other. Upon moving into our new house, somebody gave us bread. Bread makes a house a home. The nutritional aspects of bread can be debated by others at a later date. But today, I want us to think on the social and spiritual aspects, the things that really feed us. Now, I think there are qualities about bread that might tell us about ourselves. My unscientific speculation puts forth the following theories. The rougher the texture of the bread, the more you care for the environment. Rumor has it that the Sierra Club will be marketing bread that contains recycled cardboard. Now, if your bread is pre-sliced and shaped like perfect squares, you probably like order in your life. And I bet your lawn looks nice as well. Now, it's possible to buy bread that is tied into knots. Some people do this for religious reasons, and others just like to add drama to their lives. Buying unsliced bread will show a wild side, a willingness to make your own path. One may even be so bold as to drive your SUV off the road. Bread can be round. That way, it ensures that everybody gets more crust than they need. Do you remove the crusts of bread for your children? Now, I always felt like I was being a tad overprotective when I did this. I mean, shouldn't kids be taught to face the obstacles in life, to embrace living on the edge? You should learn to take the good with the bad. But then again, I liked the crust best, and so it was a small sacrifice for me to eat my son's crust as well as his, my own. Lately, I've seen in my grocer's freezer frozen peanut butter and jelly sandwiches without crust. Who buys this? You don't have to raise your hand. But I haven't been able to figure it out, because I'm thinking that if I'm a parent on the go, it's going to take more time to defrost this peanut butter sandwich. And, that if people haven't figured out the recipe yet, I really don't want them driving to the store. Sometimes bread is just practical. So my favorite is banana bread. And, bread can be healthy, but if you add enough fat and sugar to it, it can be a dessert. But my love for banana bread came from a very good reason. We owned a grocery store, and the bananas often got too ripe to sell. And so Mom would take them home and say, well, I guess I'll make banana bread. And this taught me that it's possible to transform a bad situation. Instead of garbage, we had gourmet bread. Instead of wasted fruit, we had tasty food. Instead of a business loss, we had a family feast. Close your eyes. Close your eyes and inhale through your nose. Smell your favorite bread. It's there in the memory of your nostrils. And as you're smelling that bread, in your mind, look around. Who are the people sharing this bread with you? These are your family. These are your people. This sharing of bread involves the sharing of stories. Earlier this week, I asked Ruth Clemenson, why do you always bring a cake wherever you go? And this is one of her cakes, and I'm sure we've all tasted them at some point. And it arose out of community. She had a group that met at her church in Bethesda, Maryland, and she always went swimming beforehand, and so she could never bring a hot dish. But to bring a cake, which she could make the night before, was always welcome. It is easy to transport, and people enjoy it. We have other stories. I have a couple people that I'm going to bring up to talk about their bread. First, I'd like to invite Michelle to talk about some of the bread that she's made here, and then Lucy, and then open it up to all who want to talk.
Okay. I'm short. Is this going to work?
Adjustable.
Okay, thanks. Actually, I brought 2 types of bread today. Charlie came to me this week in the hall and said he wanted this bread to be something that meant something to me. So the first thing, as a Southern girl, was a biscuit. Came right into my head. I was raised on them. It was a Sunday ritual in my grandmother and my aunt's house. I modernized these and added white cheddar and chives. So they're a Southern biscuit of the millennium, I guess. Then I thought, well, that's kind of easy to do since we're all in the South. And so I wanted to think of something else. And I'm a pastry chef, so I know a lot about bread. And as I was thinking about it this week, I thought back about 6 years when I lived in Wisconsin. My mother-in-law came up for Christmas, and her parents are from Denmark and Norway and in that region, and she unfolded this thing in my kitchen and announced that she had brought something called lefse. Okay, well, I had no idea what lefse was. I was like, okay, let's taste this. And I thought, maybe it's time that I learn how to make lefse. So I called her this week and I said, well, I've been married almost 9 years, and I think it's time for me to learn the other side of my family's traditions. So we got together yesterday over 2 hours and made this. It's actually a potato flatbread. We decided to call it a Norwegian tortilla yesterday. This I've made in the more traditional manner, which after you make it, you put butter and sugar on it and then roll it up and eat it. I went on the internet to learn a little more about it. Apparently now it's been modernized, and there was over 250 different recipes on there. But the tradition behind this was in the fall and before the very cold winters set in, a group of women would go around the village and make lefse for the year for each household. And then at the end, apparently, they would make enough lefse to fit in a barrel, and the men going out to sea would carry it with them to have to eat for the rest of the winter. So that is the stories behind my breads.
And Lucy.
Coming from a New York Jewish family, you eat bread, cornbreads, rye breads, and cornbread isn't anything like Southern cornbread, and you can't get it anymore, maybe on Arthur Avenue in the Bronx. But my mother used to bake cinnamon raisin bread, and the smell in the house was phenomenal, and I'm addicted to cinnamon. So anything with cinnamon wins me over. So mine's a challah because I like the eggy, richer flavor with cinnamon raisin. But my fondest memories of bread was when my uncle and aunt would come from the Bronx with the fresh cornbread that had just come out of the oven that they would pick up, and we'd sit around the kitchen and the family would be together, and it would be a really, really special time. And so bread means family and togetherness for me.
Does anyone else have memories of bread that they want to share?
I'm Marjorie Gelbin, and I'm also from Brooklyn, New York. And this is a tale of how far one goes to get a piece of bread. When we moved down to Raleigh originally and then to Winston-Salem, we discovered quite quickly that you can't get a Jewish rye here. I don't care what Arnold's says, Arnold's the packaged bread. It's not Jewish rye. And so when we go back to visit our friends in Washington, D.C., or we visit our friends in Florida, we head for the nearest bakery, and we buy 15 loaves of Jewish rye, and we bring them home in the car. And you talk about the smell of bread on the highway. We don't even open the windows so the smell stays in. But we have 15 loaves of Jewish rye in the freezer, and it's not sliced. My husband slices it for him, each individual portion he slices, because otherwise it gets stale too fast. But if you want to taste a good Jewish rye, call me.
Hi, I'm Sharon Miller. When I was in graduate school a long time ago in Cleveland, I was in school for being a social worker, and my specialization was geriatrics. And I worked in a nursing home, and part of what I did is I ran a memory group for women who were in the beginning stages of Alzheimer's and other types of dementia and memory loss. And one day, one of the most memorable groups for me was I brought in a fresh-baked loaf of bread that I'd made the night before. It was about 6 women and myself. And I was very young, probably 21. And what we did is we cut the bread and we passed it around with butter. And I had everyone tell me memories of bread that they remembered. And, even though they had lost so many of their recent memories of their life and their day-to-day life, they all had stories to share about how important bread was for them. And, I will always remember that group, and I think the bread session was the most memorable for me.
Okay.
Bread means a whole lot to me because my mother made all of our bread growing up. But despite the fact that she worked full-time every week, and she made 8 loaves of bread. So the smell and the memories are very, very strong.
Didn't expect to find myself up here this morning, but this brought back such a memory that I thought I'll go up there and tell this story. I love to cook and do as often as I can. A couple of years ago, we went to California to visit my daughter Katie and my son-in-law and grandchildren. They had just moved back into their beautiful new home with a beautiful new kitchen with a gorgeous new oak floor, and had just shown it to me the night before, and so on. Well, the next morning, Ed and I came down, and nobody was in the kitchen yet, but in the oven was a really large pan of biscuits, which my son-in-law had gotten up and made as sort of as a gift to having his mother-in-law and father-in-law visit. And I looked around and I thought, well, where is everybody? And those biscuits are going to burn. Better get them out of there. Nobody came down, and I reached and found a pot holder, and I pulled the biscuit pan out of the oven and thought, well, I'll put it down. But as I did, the pan doubled in half. The 24 biscuits flew in the air, and went everywhere. And the pan was hot, and the pan went flying across the new oak floor. And my dear son-in-law, who's very tolerant, walked in and said, "Martha!" And he had the most awful look on his face. And I still try to impress him a little. To this day, I don't even want to mention biscuits to him. And I don't think he'll ever make another biscuit for me.
Actually, I was going to tell a bread story, and we'll continue. I remember as a young child making nut bread with my sister and my mom, and the three of us would make nut bread. We'd literally take the walnuts, crack them with the cracker, chop them with a knife, and get all the fine particles of the nuts, put them in, and make this wonderful bread, which often served as the centerpiece for holiday care packages that we would make surrounding with cookies. Well, we've continued some of that tradition in our home. I'll bake nut bread with our girls around Thanksgiving, and we serve it at Thanksgiving. And it always reminds me of being with my family and having that wonderful smell in the house and the bread there. So.
I just want to share kind of a weird experience. When I was in Vietnam, 3 in the morning, we would fly to Saigon and get bread right as it was coming out of the oven. Saigon, that was kind of neat. If I remember my history correctly, there's a section.
To the mic. You have a softer voice. Speak. Sorry, Herb.
If I remember my history correctly, there's a section of England called Sandwich, and there was a man there, the Earl of Sandwich, who first took bread and put it together in the form of a sandwich.
Bread can actually, Martha's story notwithstanding, bread can actually raise your status somewhat, I think. I remember about 10 years ago in our international dining club that one day I was assigned the task of making a very complicated Spanish bread. And you had to twist it and make knots and then cut it and then do it the other way and all this. And then you put it in the oven in long loaves and you had to paint it with egg and all this stuff. And our group has never quite forgotten it because it was really good bread. I don't do it often, but you know, they kind of, I gained some status from that, something I've been glad to have.
I belong to the Historical Education Society at SCA. My first feast of crowding duty about 2.5 years ago, I took a feast for 80 people, and I thought, oh, I've never made bread before. I'll make bread for everybody at the feast. And I thought, okay, can't be too hard. So I did it, and I was surprised that I had a knack for making bread, and it's really fun, and I love it. And I went home and made some bread for my grandparents. My grandmother comes in the kitchen, and she says, well, how do you do this, and how do you do that? Because it turns out her mother always made bread. Her kitchen was always a mess and covered in flour. And so, I don't know if it's genetic or something, like it skipped a generation or two, but
Bernice here.
I'm Bernice Uhl, and it brought back a lot of memories for me because I grew up on a farm in western New York State, and I guess it dates me, but it was before they had loaf bread, at least in the stores very prevalently. And my mother made bread every Saturday. She was a teacher, and so she had to do her work like that on Saturday. And so I was brought up, learned how to make bread from my mother, and always the memory I remember the most is that after the baking was done, she made rolls and loaves. After the baking was done, all the kids they could come, and all 4 of us, and have a hot roll out of the oven with butter on it. And I guess all those memories are something that have become if I ever smell bread, those all come back, just like as if I was living it all over again. And it was quite a few years before finally Wonder Bread came in the stores, and my poor mother had a little more time to do something else besides make bread on Saturdays.
Dave.
One of my fondest memories of my youth is having usually around holidays, my family would gather over at my grandma's house. It was only about 5 or 6 blocks before my father's house was. And we'd have a holiday meal, Thanksgiving, Christmas, whatever. And of course, one of the highlights of the meal were the biscuits and rolls that my grandma used to make from scratch. But the memory that's most fondest to me is not what I ate on the holiday, but the next day. I would get on my bicycle and ride from my dad's house over to my grandma's house, and she used to store all whatever was left over down in the basement. And there was usually a big platter of biscuits and rolls or something like that, and they started to age, and they weren't quite as fresh as they were the day before. But boy, I would gorge myself. No jam, no butter, just raw biscuits and rolls.
My father was a chef on freighter in the Great Lakes, home from like the 1st of December to the 1st of March when the lakes froze over. You can come all day. And that was bread baking time in our house. And I can remember it was a baby bathtub, we called it a balia in Polish. And he would have this balia, would be on our kitchen table, and it would be filled with dough, a mound that high. And he used to make this, we called it a sweet bread or a makówka in Polish, and it had raisins in it, and it was very sweet, and he'd make like 40 loaves of this bread. And the highest compliment you can pay a Polish baker is to say, he has a good dough. And my father had a good dough.
All this talk is getting me hungry, and we're going to be sharing some of this bread in our coffee hour afterwards. And we're going to sing about 3 times through a very short hymn, From You I Receive, To You I Give. It's number 402 in your please rise as you're able. I receive, to you I give, together we share, and from this we live. From you